Thank you, Rosalie, for a lovely introduction and for organizing tonight's event. And thank you, distinguished panelists, for so generously agreeing to share with us your reactions and thoughts about the book and the topic of the evening's discussion. As Rosalie pointed out, New York 2000 is a collaborative effort, and I'd like to introduce my co-authors, David Fishman and Jacob Tilove, who are here with us tonight. In the late 1970s and 1980s, the city's traditional planning process was in disarray, traumatized by the specter of Robert Moses and constrained by what might be called a strict constructionist interpretation of Jane Jacobs' ideas. As a result, preservation, and especially the preservation of historic districts, filled the void, virtually replacing traditional planning. Though in no way official policy, the substitution of preservation for planning did not go unnoticed and was by no means completely welcome in all quarters. As the developer Daniel Rose put it in 1980, when the creation of the Upper East Side Historic District was being debated, and you see on the screen some of the important early districts of the period in question, as Dan said, to protect specific buildings in historic preservation is to petrify 60 busy square blocks in urban planning, and that is urban planning run amok. Yet others insisted that absent a nuanced zoning, only the creation of historic districts could preserve the scale, character, and density and diversity of whole neighborhoods, and that this could be done without freezing their evolution. Such frequently proved to be the case, as in the case of the Flatiron District, not on the screen, a neighborhood where historic districting, by stabilizing the area's future, actually stimulated development and economic rejuvenation. That was the case in any number of districts, but the Flatiron, in my opinion, was the most vivid of them all. But in my brief introduction to tonight's panel, I would rather turn your attention to preservation issues that arose in relationship to individual buildings rather than neighborhoods. Though the period covered by New York 2000 can be seen as a golden era of neighborhood preservation, many significant individual buildings were lost. Just months before the adoption of the Upper East Side Historic District in 1981, William Hanby and George Nelson's Sherman Fairchild residence of 1941, that was at 17 East 65th Street, not very far from where we are tonight, perhaps the most distinguished townhouse of the era and a glory of the international style, was replaced. While many of us regretted the loss of Hanby and Nelson's house, or the seeming future loss of it, we took consolation in the fact that Michael Graves was at work designing a facade for the building's new owners, French & Company. Shown here are 5 elevation studies and a model by Graves. But instead of Michael Graves, another New Jersey architect, Milton Kline, got the nod. His facade is not especially noteworthy, I shouldn't say welcome. It's not especially noteworthy, except that it activated at least some level of celebrity when it was immortalized in the creation of the fictional architect David Tolchin in Woody Allen's 1986 film, Hannah and Her Sisters. Played by Sam Waterston, you may remember this, the Tolchin character, in a brilliant send-up of architectural doublespeak, claims that the facade is deliberately non-contextual, but I wanted to keep the atmosphere of the street in the proportions and in the materials, end quote. Woody Allen would himself become an important preservation protagonist, but that is another story. Disturbingly, the Landmarks Preservation Commission sometimes refused to intercede despite the best efforts of civic organizations, preservationists, and other concerned citizens and neighborhoods to have cases heard. Despite sustained protests over more than a decade, the Commission refused to hold hearings for E.H. Fales' Cottages, a delightful two-story, stylistically transitional taxpayer of 1937, consisting of street-level retail topped by 8 one-bedroom garden-facing apartments on the west side of 3rd Avenue between 77th and 78th Streets, which was replaced in 2000 by Hartman and Cox apartment building called the Empire. One can hardly remember an instance where more pressure was brought to bear on behalf of a building than in the case of the concerted effort organized to preserve Edward Durrell Stone's 1964 Huntington Hartford Gallery, also known as 2 Columbus Circle. Yet again, the Landmarks Commission refused to calendar a public hearing to discuss the building's merits, and Stone's landmark structure was lost. Its historically important, artistically unique facade replaced by Allied Works Museum of Art and Design, now under construction. In some cases, more important buildings were lost because of, I should say important buildings, not more important. Important buildings were lost because of the constraints of the landmarks law itself. With barely a moment's notice in 2001, surprising everyone, including its architect, Richard Meyer, the Bronx Development Center, realized between 1970 and 1977 in the Pelham Bay section of the Bronx, was thoughtlessly destroyed and replaced by the most ordinary of corporate office parks, with the Landmarks Commission stymied by the fact that the building was simply too young, less than 30 years old, to be considered for designation. There are many and various reasons that can be used, or can be cited, I should say, to explain the loss of the Fairchild House, of 2 Columbus Circle, and of Meyer's Bronx buildings. But behind each case, there lies the undisputed fact that the established preservation community was ambivalent, and may still be ambivalent, about what is called modern architecture. This is not so hard to understand because the preservation movement grew up seeing modern architecture as the anathema to the fine buildings of New York's collected past. In an irony of strange bedfellows, excellent architects were sometimes retained or co-opted, however you want to say, to sweeten the bitter pill on controversial developments proposed for historic settings. For example, in 1981, soon after the establishment of the Upper East Side Historic District, Agrest and Gandalsonis proposed an apartment house on East 71st Street, it's in your left slide, that was narrowly rejected by the Landmarks Commission, although every architect on the commission gave their approval to what was in effect a sliver tower dressed in a ball gown. On your right, James Polshek's 1986 plan to build above McKim Mead and White's Metropolitan Club was also praised as a thoughtful design, yet objected to on grounds of overbuilding by tonight's moderator, among others, Paul Goldberger, then the architecture critic for the Times, who wrote that the proposal was, quote, better than most of what gets built in the city and better than almost any tower that has been put up beside or astride a landmark building. Even more vexing than the problem of new buildings in historic settings was that posed by the expansion needs of historic buildings housing important and public institutions. Gwathmey Siegel's proposal for the expansion of the Guggenheim Museum was successfully realized, but only after a fierce battle that resulted in a compromised design in 1992. However, the Whitney Museum was never able to garner support for any of the 3 expansion schemes proposed by Michael Graves. The evolution of the Guggenheim's addition from a more confrontational to a more subtly nuanced approach was only one manifestation of a changing attitude among architects and preservationists alike in the 1990s, who increasingly looked with favor for that short period of time on sympathetic additions, challenging the Secretary of the Interior's mandate that the new should be distinct from the old. For example, in his work at the Metropolitan Museum in the 1970s and early 1980s, Kevin Roach produced designs that directly confronted the existing Beaux-Arts architecture with glassy modernist additions. But by the 1990s, Roach had changed directions at the Metropolitan, where he surprised museum goers with a classical design for the Petrie Sculpture Court shown on your right. In 1993, Roach confounded the establishment with his addition to the Jewish Museum, a sly, subtle, sympathetic, and Gothic-style extension to C.P.H. Gilbert's building of 1908. In the late 1990s, and still apparently the case, the balance seems to have been tipped in the other way, with the Landmarks Commission giving its approval to some very odd stylistic bedfellows. Of course, appropriateness is in the eyes of the beholder, so I thought I'd conclude my brief introduction to tonight's panel with 3 relatively recent projects that were approved by the Landmarks Preservation Commission and leave for the panel and the audience the privilege of judgment. It's not a question of whether the new buildings I will show you are good or bad architecture. The question is whether they are appropriate or inappropriate additions to their host neighbors. Shown here is Aldo Rossi's Scholastic Building, completed in 2001, on Broadway in Soho, sandwiched between Ernest Flagg's Little Singer Building of 1904 and Alfred Zucker's Roos Building of 1890. It took only 1 hour of deliberation for the Landmarks Commission to approve the design. The second example I'd like to share with you is Davis Brody Bond's addition to the Harvard Club, finished in 2003, which also received swift endorsement by the Commission. Interestingly, the modernist architect Edward Larrabee Barnes had proposed a Georgian design for the Harvard Club's expansion in 1986. You can see that at the top right. While club members who opposed Bond's scheme commissioned another Georgian design from Richard Cameron, seen on the bottom right. Lastly, I propose for your consideration Norman Foster's Hearst Tower, finished in 2006. In addition to sailing through the Landmarks Commission, Foster's design was supported by the Municipal Arts Society, the New York Landmarks Conservancy, as well as the local community board. Given the iconicity of the tower and the power of the client, not to mention the project's impact as a significant post-2001 investment in the city's future, each body charged with passing judgment accepted the juxtaposition of the new building and its landmarked pedestal, Joseph Urban's International Magazine building of 1928. Is the Hearst building a case of one landmark deserving another? Is this a conversation across time or a case of David and Goliath? Ladies and gentlemen, I leave these questions to you. Thank you very much.